welcome to Gadflies Through History, a Gadfly City production exploring history's biggest rebels, how they freaked the world out, and then changed it forever. I'm your host, Billy O'Brien. If you want more weird stories, fly over and subscribe to Gadfly City on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and gadflycity.com. Today's episode features a modern retelling of David and Goliath. However, the villain here was not gigantic, except for his ego, and the hero did not slay her foe with rocks, but with her words. The battle took place in Washington, D.C., and starred one of its biggest bullies, opposite one of Hollywood's most controversial writers, Joe McCarthy versus Lillian Hellman. The victory was decisive. Its legacy was formidable. Up next, we'll go through this tale blow for blow, round for round, and come to understand its place in the twists and turns of American history. Hope you're enjoying this tale, you little weirdos. If you want other cool stories, then fly over to YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to Gadfly City if you haven't already. You'll find games, shows, and community buzzing all around. Visit gadflycity.com to get our newsletter. Welcome to Gadfly City, the capital of weird. Welcome back to Gadflies Through History. Exiting the Second World War, American society exploded with confidence. Roads emerged and veined the country, allowing new cities to blossom and spread across the national landscape. Families popped up inside them as flowers do in spring, and they were filled and shined brilliantly with hope and possibility. Prosperity and peace soon followed as more people earned college degrees, owned homes, and voted. However, the season quickly changed, as they typically do, to fall, and more ominous characters emerged onto the American stage. Fear, paranoia, and communism. Gone were the days of fearing Nazis and fascism, as those threats were completely and utterly dispatched. Unfortunately, as those villains disappeared, others dramatically arose in our consciousness. In fact, these were friends turned foe, because communists, or commies as the less verbose like to and typically did call them, helped us defeat our dreaded fascist enemies in World War II. They really pose no threat to our shores or souls due to their limited resources and demolished states in the aftermath of the prolonged fighting. This was true except for one thing: the spread of their ideology. Like the Salem witch trials, as Arthur Miller described them, many Americans began to look over their shoulder, fear that their neighbor, co-worker, or even their friend could be poisoned or already had been poisoned with the mere idea of communism. This posed an existential threat to their whole existence within the confines of democracy and capitalism. Other events made this terror seem even more genuine and catastrophic. First, the Soviet Union was actually taking over countries, and a bunch of them, in the 1940s. Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and a whole swath of Germany. Second, China itself fell to communism in 1949. Third, in that same year, the Soviet Union conducted its first test of a nuclear weapon. They got the bomb. Fourth, events at home, including the infamous Pumpkin Papers incident and subsequent conviction of Alger Hiss, who many presumed to be a spy, convinced many Americans that Soviets were actively infiltrating and spying on Americans in order to blot out the white and blue of this country and make it all red. This fever turned into a frenzy, the highly publicized trial and eventual executions of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The pair were executed on the same day for attempting to pass atomic secrets to the Soviet Union during a Cold War that many feared would heat up soon. Fifth, The government itself was talking tough on communism by spouting the ideas of containment and other passive-aggressive foreign relations slogans, as well as acting tough on communism by beefing up our military might, putting the Alpha and alphabet organizations and alliances, CIA, DOD, NATO, ETC, get the point, and a nod to the growing anti-communist sentiment spreading throughout the nation. Democratic President Harry Truman even demanded loyalty and new programs for federal workers, and constructed a subversives list for the Justice Department to monitor. These and other developments gave the green light for many reasonable Americans to worry about the threat of communism at home and abroad. But fortunately, this created a vacuum, and an unlikely figure emerged to take advantage of this anxiety-riddled era. Here's a trivia question. Who likes trivia? Of course, that's a trick because everyone does. Do you know Gadfly City hosts trivia game shows every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern to challenge your mind about all things weird in movies, music, history, and so much more? Bring your popcorn or sriracha peas, tell your friends and family, and compete for prizes, pride, and whatever else you want. You're invited to play Gadfly City, capital weird. Welcome back to Gadflies Through History. None jumped in and capitalized off this latent state of paranoia more than Joe McCarthy. Even before this time, though, he had already displayed a side of himself more focused on power than principle. Nearly 20 years before his entrance into the limelight, he dispatched with his allegiance to the Democratic Party in favor of the Grand Old Party for nothing more than convenience. Later, while serving in war, he attempted to exaggerate his service record in order to further his electoral ambitions. Then, once he was finally elected to office, but frustrated over his political position in D.C., he initiated an inquisition of lies to bolster his power. The day on which he unleashed this fury began like any other, but America would soon find itself unwillingly on the roller coaster of this man's demented mind. Joe was set to give a speech at a hotel in Wheeling, West Virginia. Out of nowhere, except maybe the annals of his insecurity and frustration, Mr. McCarthy announced the following. I have here in my hand a list of 205, a list of names that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department. As you know, very recently the Secretary of State claimed his loyalty to a man guilty of what has always been considered as the most abominable of crimes, being a traitor to the people who gave him a position of great trust, high treason. He has lighted the spark which is resulting in a moral uprising and will end only when the whole sorry mess of twisted, warped thinkers are swept from the national scene, so that we may have a new birth of honesty and decency in government. The very next day, at an event in Salt Lake City, backtracked and reduced the number to 57. When pressed in the Senate to bolster his claims of communism, he produced only outdated and specious evidence. However, he persisted in repeating these claims and hammering the subject for years, despite never offering any evidence to support his inflammatory accusations. This produced another, possibly more profound wave of hysteria in the United States. Yet, this was not the first time that madness like this sprung up in America. Congress itself had established a committee, House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, as it was commonly known, to sporadically investigate subversive and disloyal elements, public workers, and private citizens, especially related to communism and the rise of the Soviet Union. They had even set their sights on Hollywood in the late 40s. Their modus operandi was to try and get people to rat on their friends and coworkers, to name names that was referred to from the common plea of Congress towards their deponents. Elia Kazan was one of the most famous people to name names. On the other hand, many brave citizens failed to comply with these demands. They cited their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination in order to shield themselves and others from this persecution. They were derided and called Fifth Amendment communists in the media and public. The consequences of this action were severe for protesters, though, because many were blacklisted and barred from working. This list of nonconformists included several prominent stars of the silver screen, such as, but not limited to, the following: Charlie Chaplin, Arthur Miller, Dalton Trumbo, and Pete Seeger. Determined to be the next profiteer of panic, Joe McCarthy kicked off a similar witch hunt in his role as chairman of the Permanent Investigations Subcommittee of a Senate Committee on Government Operations. In this position, he targeted his attacks first on the Department of State. Specifically, he claimed the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, was giving shelter to communists. Then, McCarthy pointed to the department's Voice of America program, as well as certain books housed in its libraries, was giving credence to communist influences and the spread of this ideology. The Department of State quickly denied these assertions and, in a cowardly act of censorship, began removing the books that Joe complained about from their facilities. These actions, and the newly incensed public, inspired the House to take up action themselves, again through UAC. Predictably, they circled back to one of their most common targets, Hollywood. Dramatically, Congress would find that one of its strongest and nastiest critics was an actress named Lillian Hellman. Come back after the break as we find out how one determined individual would stand barricade to a locomotive of authority speeding in the wrong direction. Here's a trivia question. Who likes trivia? Of course, that's a trick, because everyone does. Do you know Gadfly City hosts trivia game shows every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern to challenge your mind about all things weird in music, movies, history, and so much more? Bring your popcorn or sriracha peas, tell your friends and family, and compete for prizes, pride, and whatever else you want. You're invited to play. Just subscribe to Gadfly City on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Welcome back to Gadflies Through History. The birth of a gadfly like Lillian Hellman started simply enough in New Orleans, Louisiana. Born into a Jewish home, her parents pursued common paths in life. Her mother was a homemaker. Her father was a shoe salesman. Yet, the wealth in her extended family allowed her to surpass this upbringing and the typical mold of a Jewish person, or even a woman at that time. Lillian attended elite boarding schools as a child, before continuing her education at New York University and Columbia University. These experiences led her to Europe, where she kept studying as well as immersing herself in political and social transformations taking place around the continent and the world. This brought her into contact that often led to romantic as well as friendly relationships, prominent figures and organizations within the burgeoning movements of fascism and communism, including many from Hollywood. Following these experiences, Lillian started a writing career in the 1930s. It did not take long before she found success creating plays, and some that drew most attention and critical acclaim included The Children's Hour, The Little Foxes, The Autumn Garden, Toys in the Attic. She traveled to Hollywood and began working on movies. She started at the bottom. MGM hired her to read and summarize books and other writings. Though modest, this job introduced her to important people in the film industry like Dashiell Hammett. Eventually, this networking and her hard work plus skill finally cracked open doors for her career. She started drafting screenplays and collaborating on significant silver screen projects such as The Dark Angel, The Children's Hour, and Dead End, among many others spanning the 1930s, the 1940s, and beyond. Down the road, her work and the notoriety it produced, combined with her controversial associations and opinions, would land Lillian in seriously hot water, but others were suspicious of her long before that. The first sign that Lillian Hellman harbored communist sympathies stemmed from her public statements, perceived socialist bent in her work. In the early part of 1937, she and nearly 100 other American leaders signed and distributed a document known as an open letter to American liberals. This letter appeared to support the Soviet Union and call for others to allow them to defend themselves in response to critics' attacks on her motives and words. Lillian replied that she was merely affirming the Soviet Union's right to protect its national sovereignty. However, she also suggested a realpolitik approach by implying that a propped-up, fledgling Soviet Union could better fight back against the growing fascist menace. Lillian encouraged others to focus on this threat rather than the controversial nature of the letter. Yet, commie hunters did not stop there. They scrutinized her password as reaffirmation of her communist loyalties. To this end, they pointed to Days to Come, Watch on the Rhine, and The Searching Wind. Frequently, these plays had anti-fascist, pro-labor, or anti-conformist views and storylines. On the other hand, none of them overtly endorsed communism or socialism. However, critics persisted like a dog on the hunt. They circled her personal relationships and organizational ties to further enforce their allegations that Lillian Hellman was a closeted Red. In particular, her on-again, off-again romance with blacklisted writer and activist Dashiell Hammett had raised eyebrows of those already concerned. Lillian's own comments about going to meetings tinged with socialism, that she was a most casual member of the Communist Party for a time, did not help her escape the spotlight either. Her association and involvement with left-leaning groups like the Screenwriters Guild and the League of American Writers seemed to make the slam-dunk case for anti-communist hardliners. Unfortunately, Lillian's subsequent actions only made things worse. Early in 1947, he turned down a contract from Columbia Pictures because a clause required her to state she had never been a member of the Communist Party and that she would not associate with subversives. Aside from forcing her and relationships with friends and lovers that had these views, Lillian thought this clause violated her constitutional rights. She refused to sign. Later that year, Congress jumped into the fray and resurrected the House Un-American Activities Committee. They charged after Hollywood and demanded it name names and rat on their colleagues who had socialist or communist sympathies. Lillian was a part of the group, known as the Hollywood 10, did not go along with this congressional investigation. While standing up to Congress, she implored others to do the same when she said, "They frighten mighty easy, and they talk mighty bad. I suggest the rest of us don't frighten so easy. It's still not un-American to fight the enemies of one's country. Let's fight." How nasty. This conspicuous public objection sheds a lot of light, not just on her motivations, but also her personality, possibly her character. It cost her, though, and she was blacklisted like the rest. Major directors stopped working with her because of her political protest. This made her a prime target for accusations and suspicion as future waves of communist hysteria rolled through America. Come back after the break as we finish Lillian's story was one of the most courageous acts ever made during the era of McCarthyism. We're listening to a show from Gadfly City, the capital of weird. Our community is built for the social rebel inside all of us. Fly over and see for yourself. Games, culture, and discussion. Sign up at gadflycity.com and subscribe to Gadfly City on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Welcome to Gadfly City, the capital of weird. Welcome back to Gadflies Through History. The nation got comic crazy again in the early 1950s. Joe McCarthy, embittered at his lack of success after many failed stunts, launched a witch hunt with lies to go after boogeymen. Following his lead, Congress pulled out some of their favorite punching bags, namely Hollywood, and once again, Lillian Hellman. She would be waiting for them. Lillian had already tussled with them before in preceding rounds of questioning in the late 40s, when the House was trying to get her to name names. Also, in a more personal controversy, the government denied her application for a passport earlier in that decade. The government did this because they considered her a working communist. Although not long after this adjudication, the Department of State reversed its ruling and awarded her a passport. However, Lillian's tangled history with the red web of communism and previous battles with the House Un-American Activities Committee that got her blacklisted in the first place put her high on Congress's most wanted list when it revved up again at the urging of tail gunner Joe McCarthy. In 1952, HUAC subpoenaed Lillian Hellman to appear and testify. As they did before, the committee wanted her to swear under oath and in public to the communist activities and beliefs of her and her friends. As she did before, Lillian objected to the notion of ratting out her friends. In a famous letter she sent to Congress outlining her reasons for refusing their demands, she suggested that humanity should trump politics when she wrote the following: "I do not like subversion or disloyalty in any form, and if I had ever seen any, I would have considered it my duty to have reported it to the proper authorities. But to hurt innocent people whom I knew many years ago in order to save myself is, to me, inhuman and indecent and dishonorable." This was not enough for her. She went on to strike at the heart of the American Inquisition itself, erected and employed to gut our rights in the guise of security. Lillian did this later in that same letter when she said, "I cannot and will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashion." Lillian had more in store for HUAC than these nasty words, though. She showed up and stared down Congress right after delivering this message to them. The baffled, blustering committee members barely muster any questions at all for her. Lillian was dismissed without any penalty. Her famous words, the public stand, shielded American democracy from the cutting winds of megalomania. Zooming out from the fight she picked with Congress, we see more than a modern retelling of David versus Goliath. We see a gadfly buzzing around the United States government and refusing to bend, break, or go away. Further still, we see her punching back. How nasty. Thank goodness she did. We must wonder where those nasty flies hover now that will fight back like Lillian did, especially when one flies around the world and sees power run amok. They might seek encouragement and ammunition in the words she used and the life she lived. Thank you for listening to this tale. Join us next time as we journey to the end of the Rainbow Coalition in rebel history of Jesse Jackson. Gadflies Through History is a Gadfly City production. My name's Billy O'Brien, and if you like this episode and want more weird stories, fly over and subscribe to Gadfly City on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, gadflycity.com.